Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our session today, um, Cultivating Learning, and today's session is using primary sources for teaching, learning, and understanding. And some of you have already been introducing yourselves in the chat. Thank you so much for coming. And if you're just coming in now, please feel free to introduce yourselves. My name is Philippa Rappaport. I'm the lead for education and engagement at the Smithsonian Office of Educational Technology. That's a central education office at the Smithsonian and the office behind the Smithsonian Learning Lab. And I'm joined today by Anne Helmreich. She's the director of the Archives of American Art. In our session today, Anne will discuss how we can use primary sources to engage students in journeys of discovery, critical thinking, and subject-based active learning. Anne will share approaches, resources, and learning activities developed through the department's program that's called Teaching with Primary Sources. And she'll ground today's presentation in the National Guidelines for Primary Source Literacy. Anne will demonstrate how to elicit transformational experiences while advancing students' skills in close reading, close listening, and assessing evidence. And you'll leave the session today with a better understanding of how to access and use the resources of the Archives of American Art, how primary source literacy is applicable to a wide range of subjects, and why engaging students with primary sources in the age of artificial intelligence is so important. Anne joined the Smithsonian just 2 years ago, but she'll share with us today techniques and strategies that she's honed over decades. So I'm so pleased that she's here. A few logistics before we get started. One thing I just wanted to introduce people also in the background, we have Rhett Ransom, who's our IT specialist, and Kat Cook, who's the Learning Lab product owner at the Office of Educational Technology, and also Joy Horton, who's providing our captions today. We'd love for this to be as interactive as possible, so please feel free to put your comments in the chat. You might want to tag it so that it goes to everyone instead of just to the hosts and panelists, but whatever you prefer is fine. And then if you have questions, you can put those in the chat, or you can feel free to use the Q&A function, and I'll check those later. But we will try to answer questions as they come and comments, and we really invite you to share as much as you want to share. Okay, you're already introducing yourselves in the chat, so that's great. The image you see here is, this is the cover page of the Learning Lab. So today's programming is part of a series of programming that we do really to help educators engage with digital museum content. And the Learning Lab is a free online platform where you can discover all of the digitized museum content from across the Smithsonian's 21 museums and research centers and the National Zoo. And then you can use that platform to create interactive experiences with the resources and then share them with others. So we did create a Learning Lab collection to accompany today's session, and I'll put that link in the chat shortly. If you're interested in using the lab, you can always access the help page, which you can access from the bottom of any screen in the lab. And there's a little link at the top there that will take you to our webinars and events. And that's where within a few days of today's session, I'll post the recording of this archived session on that events page. Upcoming sessions for Cultivating Learning. Next month, February 18th, we'll be joined by Orlando Serrano. He is from the National Museum of American History, and Orlando's session is called Cultivating a Listening Practice. And then in March, on March 25th, we'll be joined by Adrian Aldaba. He's from the National Museum of the American Latino. We're still figuring out the title for that, but we've got the date. Okay. So a reminding that this session will be recorded. And for some of you who have been with us already, we like to start out with a question. And today's question is, how do you teach your students about evidence? So please feel free to put those comments in the chat, and I'll turn it over to Anne to get us started. Thank you so much.
Hi, Philippa. I'm thrilled to be here. So as we wait for some responses to come in, I will just share that I am a former teacher. And so I'm thrilled to be here. And I, as Philippa said, I've just been here in Washington, D.C. for 2 years, but I have worked in Cleveland, Ohio, Chicago, Illinois, Fort Worth, Texas, and Los Angeles, California. So it's exciting to see people coming from different parts of the world. So we'd love to hear your thoughts about how you teach your students about evidence. What is evidence? How do you critically evaluate evidence? How do you recognize evidence? So thinking about evidence, I know we've got some social studies teachers out there. We've got some history teachers out there. And as a history major, as an undergrad, I can remember my teachers talking a lot about evidence. So how do you approach that question of thinking with your students about evidence? Love to hear from you. Oh, great. I'm going to call out some of these LibGuides from universities. If people aren't familiar with those, I'd love to call those out. I think teaching in partnership with librarians is great, and LibGuides are usually great introductions to topics, and you can find them, and a lot of universities make them publicly available. I see another one, follow-up questions. I think that's great, and it really builds nicely to what we're going to be talking about later, about listening and what the next session will be. If you haven't seen one about helping students think about evidence like a lawyer or a journalist. Yeah. Starting with observation. I also like this idea of writing. Sometimes you really begin to pay attention as you try to change from what you're seeing visually into written language. Yeah. Proof. Joshua Walker, I love that. How do you know? Yeah. How do you know? Philippa is lifting up. I use see, think, wonder protocol. See, think, wonder. Wonderful. Starting with that visual observation, then that kind of thinking it over, and then asking the questions. Great. There's a lot of great teaching tips right there in the chat. This is just fabulous. Great. Well, I hope what I'm going to share with you today, I feel like it is going to build on what you've already suggested, whether it's, as I see one person offering, modeling that or prompting that behavior. And again, I like that see, think, wonder. I think that'll fit in nicely with what we're talking about. So, if people haven't seen Jessica talking about point of view, perspective, point of view, I think that's really valuable too. Evaluate, I think that word evaluate is going to come up as well. So this is great. This is absolutely great. So Philippa, I know we could just stay on this question all afternoon because I love all the tips coming in, but maybe we should move forward because I know we have another thinking exercise coming up. So as Philippa mentioned, I want to introduce the idea of primary source literacy, although I feel based on the answers that came in, this is very much something that many of you are already deeply engaged in. But we will talk about what is primary source literacy. That'll set up some learning objectives for our time together. And why primary source literacy, what objectives you can achieve with your students with that. And then, as Philippa mentioned, we've been running a program here at the archives called Teaching with Primary Sources. So I'm going to share out a few lessons learned from that, as well as some digital sources that you'll also find in that learning collection that Philippa put together for you. So we'll take some lessons learned from that program, and then I'll talk about some additional shared sources. So that's how we'll spend our time together. And as Philippa said, she's built this beautiful collection that goes behind that will support many of these points. And she's just dropped it into chat. So Philippa, if you're still, I don't want to take you away from chat. Yes, thank you. So my goal for you, for us, really, is by the end of the session, you'll be able to describe a primary source. And as I said, I think a lot of you already do a lot of that, because really in many ways, primary sources are evidence. And the kinds of ways you've been talking about evidence are the ways we would talk about primary sources in our program. So, and then the learning objectives you can achieve by working with primary sources. Again, another way to think about evidence. Strategies for working with and learning from primary sources, and then finding and sharing digital resources. In full transparency, I'm going to lean heavily on our collections, the Archives of American Art, but certainly you could do this, and we have some few resources with materials from American history, from Library of Congress, from other repositories. I saw we have colleagues from the Northwest Railroad Museum. I am sure they have primary sources we could do these same exercises with. So that's what we hope to achieve together. So for those of you who are interested, and I know we saw somebody in chat speaking of LibGuides, is there are national guidelines if you're interested in what is primary source literacy. And these were developed by the American Council of Research Libraries and then shared with a whole network of other library and archives. And they define primary sources as material in a variety of formats. And I really like to stress that variety of formats. I think if I think back to my grade school, I think primary sources, had to be like a letter. It had to be in paper. Well, digital, it doesn't matter whether it's paper or digital. And for example, for us, we collect diaries, letters, correspondence, and consider those primary sources, but we also do oral history interviews. And we have over 2,600 oral history interviews. You can find this with other repositories. And again, a cassette recording of someone can be a primary source. So the format isn't really the key thing. It's that it's evidence that documented a time period, an event, a work, people, or ideas. And that's why we wanted to ask that question about evidence. All of you talking about that were probably in fact talking about, as I said, working with primary sources. So they're a piece of evidence. But I love also the point of view that we heard from, I think, Jessica, that they also represent a point of view, a perspective. So the primary source literacy is referring to the knowledge, the skills, the ability to find that primary source. And we're going to come back to that point. The journey itself can be of learning value. So I think don't shortchange that. So can you effectively find a primary source? They jump ahead already to interpreting, but I would like to add in here, can you read it closely, listen closely? And I think that notion of observing, of asking questions, that's all part of that close observation. Then interpret, evaluate, that's a word we saw a lot come up a lot in the chat, and ethically use. And I think that ethically use gets back to that point of view or perspective. Whose point of view is it? Do I understand whose point of view is it? And then sometimes that really comes down, do I have permission to use this? Can I take something like this into my classroom? And often it's tied to specific disciplinary context, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the goal is to create new knowledge or revise existing understanding. So really helping our students maybe question assumptions or reach new conclusions on their own, using these primary sources as building blocks. So this is primary source literacy. Sounds fancy, but again, I think it's probably something all of you are already doing. Philippa, do you want to go ahead? So I've been thinking a lot about primary source literacy. I don't know if you can tell, I will briefly describe myself. I am a middle-aged woman with very gray hair. And I, with my readers on, and I finished my teaching training in the mid-90s. And there's been a big study by the Pew Charitable Trust that said as recently as 1995, 42% of Americans had never heard of the internet. So the moment I was being trained, the internet wasn't really something that we thought about in teaching practice. And now it's everywhere, right? I mean, your students, they're using it all the time. And as the trust report indicated, it's the first place people often go to for news, information, entertainment, social interaction. So how do people learn how to critically evaluate the evidence they find there? And how do they know it's trustworthy? So I think the need for primary source literacy is even stronger today than when I finished my teacher training in the 90s. And particularly true for teens. They've just done this report on teens, social media, and technology. Nearly half of the US teens, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, say they're on the internet almost constantly. So, in terms of primary source literacy as a field of study or how it's used, if you look at this, this is a graph that's been done about articles about primary source literacy on teaching and learning with primary sources. Look how it takes off in the mid-90s. So it's almost as the internet grows, the field responds by saying we need to think much more about teaching and learning with primary sources. So as the internet takes off, this teaching and learning approach grows as well. And I know 2016 looks like a blip, but that's because that's where they stopped their collecting. So it continues to grow. Turning to that question of disciplines, most of the literature on teaching with primary sources kind of reflects who's in the room with us today. A lot of history, social studies folks I saw, or people from humanities, art, myself, I consider a part of the humanities. The sciences tend to be underrepresented, but if you're a science teacher, don't log out, stay on, because the sciences could be very much part of primary sources. For example, a lot of science teachers try to teach their students how to use a lab notebook to keep the data about an experiment. Looking at a lab notebook from a scientist before us could be a way of engaging with primary sources. So how could we learn from how a lab scientist ran a lab? How, for example, DNA was discovered. So I think why we think of primary sources is something that people do in history, social studies, humanities. They can be very much brought into the sciences and other disciplines. You just don't find as many examples of that happening, but doesn't mean it can't. So why think about primary source literacy? Like what are some of its advantages as a teaching approach? So I'm going to ask Philippa to kind of click through some answers to this question. So it's experience-based. And in my teaching practice and my teaching training, one of the things that we really emphasize is the way there's so many students have different learning styles. So for those students who really benefit from experience-based, they struggle sometimes with abstract thinking, but if they have a hands-on approach, they do much better. Primary source literacy could be a really strong way to capture those students. So it's experience-based. If we want to keep on going, Philippa, it's active learning. It's not passive, it's not the lecture. They are doing the work, they are doing the questioning, as you said, how do I use evidence-based? So you're making really experience-based active learning. But keep going. And what I also like about primary source learning is you can adopt it one-on-one. You can design assignments that are classroom environments that are for the individual or for a group setting. So that the approach works both in both contexts. It could be digital or analog. You can work with materials you find on the internet, Or you could have students bring things in like a letter from their grandparents that might discuss a world event or something like that. Although I say that, and now my father sends all my nieces and nephews emails, but nonetheless, I'm sure someone can find an actual letter. Next, and then another thing about primary source literacy is it can be a way to do partnership teaching with librarians or other stewards of collections, primary sources. As I said, we saw that the Northwest Railroad Museum is here. So it's sometimes a great way to partner. Somebody mentioned teaching their students to think like a journalist. You could even bring in a journalist to help you think about primary source literacy. If you're a journalist, where do you get your evidence from? What do you consider your primary sources? And there's one more here. I will say one thing that I've learned, and we'll talk a little bit more later about lessons learned. If you decide to say, for example, take the students to a library, take them to the museum, I love it. We love hosting students here, but I always try to remember to include time for acclimating the students to a new setting. It can be really, you probably all experience this, very distracting for them because they're looking around. They have so many questions. They're in a new environment. So I really encourage partnerships. I really encourage site visits, field trips, but just build in that acclimation to get them kind of oriented, kind of calm down and ready to engage in that learning. And again, I'm sure you've all experienced this. As I said, we are not here at the archives, the only museum library archive thinking about primary sources, primary source literacy. So I wanted to share with you a few other digital resources that I like to go to. I think our own colleagues up the road at the Library of Congress has a wonderful getting started with primary sources bundle, if you will. They have grading rubrics and other things that I find really, really useful. There's also, if you're not aware of it, a teachers group called Teaching with Primary Source Collective. And people post content, blogs, ideas. So I always find it really kind of invigorating to dip into that and get some ideas from colleagues and share ideas there. And then I would be remiss not to point out that my colleagues down the road at the American History Museum also have a guide to primary sources. And again, Philip has put this all in the learning collection, but I wanted just to give you some context here. Why did I pick out these three? These are sort of my go-tos. Colleagues at Smithsonian, Teaching with Primary Source Collective, and Library of Congress. So there's plenty of others out there, but these are ones that I have found particularly useful. So let's switch gears a little bit. I've been talking for a while, and let's be students together. So I've put on the screen a primary source. This is a photograph from our collections. And let's use the chat function again. What do you notice? What do you notice? Just any observations. Again, wear your student hat for a moment. And what do you notice? Those observing black and white photo, gazes in different directions. Yep, a river. They're outside. Yep. Students, yep, outdoor learning, art making outside. Older man, we're seeing some generation differences. Yeah, and some people seem to be doing, some people watching. Right, right. Yep, one with the pencil very focused in the foreground, engaged. So Philip, I am going to answer what we're looking at. Art making, paintbrush. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. The older man in the middle with glasses holding a paintbrush. Yep. Yes, these are the subjects of the photograph would self-identify as Asian American. So Philippa, let's go to the next one. This is going to be a little counterintuitive. This is the backside. Let's continue to look. What do you notice? What do you observe? And I know it might be a bit hard to read the pencil in the upper. I will reveal that. Date and pencil, date in upper corner. Tape, love it. Somebody noticed the tape. Great. Yep, Esther's got it. Tanforin, yep. Age marks. Yeah, and in fact, Philippa, if you don't mind, could we go back one? If you look at some of those age marks on the back, can you now see them showing up in the front? So if you look at between the two drawing supports that are being used, yep, there's a crease there. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So some wear and tear. Yeah. Great. So let's go ahead to the next one, Philippa. Yeah, this is a paper photo, the corners award. Exactly. Many of you have already begun to ask the questions and begin to think about context, trying to understand what was happening here. So the gentleman with glasses in the middle ground is Chiro Obata. He was an artist and he was at the Japanese incarceration center at Tanforin. And they decided, he and several other artists that were there decided to start an art school to help both keep students, the young people occupied, but also as a way to keep their skills going, create a sense of community, invigoration. And one of my colleagues here at the archives has written this blog post that gives more context. So I love how all of you were kind of working through what do I see and observe, and then adding more context to it. So that journey from seeing, observing to asking questions. And then if you would go back to where this image is found, you would get more of that context for that image. A couple other things that some of you, I think, have already caught up with. The fact that it has that tape means that that photograph probably was put up someplace, right? It was mounted someplace. The fact that it was creased, we may not know the answers to all those questions, but the fact that it wasn't like preserved inside a photo album, but was clearly put up someplace with tape shows that it was meant to be shared. And Esther's right, we don't know who created it. So here at the archives, we were given the papers of this artist, and this photograph was amongst those papers. So we know he saved it, we know he treasured and valued it, but we weren't given the information about who made this photograph at the Assembly Center. Yes, so the art classes were not just for the participants, but a form of community engagement, which I think explains why you see some of the other young people as they're sort of enticing them to think about participating in the future. Great. So this is a wonderful example, I think, of starting with a primary source document. And I really wanted to emphasize looking at the front and the back to go on that journey of discovery and use it as a place, as some of you have already suggested, to observe, to ask questions and wonder what happened here. And you may not, to Esther's point, ever know all the answers to the questions, but I think just even the act of asking the questions can be really valuable. And I think one great question would be to even ask students to speculate, why would Obata have saved this? Why, when he leaves the camp, would he take this with him? Why was this important to him? Why would he value this? Philippa, let's go to the next slide. Now, I will say works of art can be primary sources of evidence. And this is a work of art by the same artist, Obata. And you could certainly do some of these same exercises. Ask the students what's happening here. This is very much done in a Japanese woodblock, woodcut style. But in fact, it was done in the high Sierras, showing that, yes, he had Japanese influences, but was working in California, working in the United States. And that was really important for his artistic practice. Philippa, could I trouble you just to go back to our primary source photograph for 1 second? So if everyone could hold on to this image in a moment, I'm going to have another question for you thinking about this image. So if you can hold on to it in your minds, and then Philippa, I'll ask you to jump ahead to the next new slide for all of us. So if we go back to that Obata photograph, what topics might you explore with your students? What topics might you use that primary source photograph as almost a launching pad? Or if I shown in the image, can we think of that primary source as the stone that drops in the pool and causes these ripples that takes you out to other topics? Starting with that Obata photograph of his art school, what topics might you explore with your students? Where might you take that journey of discovery with them? Teaching outside of a classroom. Treatment of Asian Americans, absolutely. Life in an internment camp, art during adversity. Yep, internment camps. Yeah, the history of World War II. Yeah, and people engaging with nature. And very much that was his practice. Abado very much worked from nature, as you saw in the role of art in a time of trouble. Yeah, and how did children experience life in the camps? What did it mean to be that age? Student and teacher. Yeah. Artifacts, US citizenship. Right, right. The history of citizenship. Yeah, these families had to leave suddenly, could only take a few things with them. These are all great topics. And you can see, for those of you in history and social studies, how do students learn art skills during World War II? So this doesn't have to be just about art. I mean, it can be about how you learn from observing. But yeah, it can be a way to think about the larger context of when these took place. Yeah. Stephanie, I love that kind of compare and contrast question, similarities and differences about life on World War II home front for different people. That could be a great way to make this not just a US based lesson, but a kind of almost global lesson. Yeah. Yeah, there's many other primary sources for in the classroom that we could do. And our collections, I'll show you in a little bit, are full of those photographs, digitized resources. Yeah. Preservation of history through art. Right. I think that notion, what would be lost if we didn't have that photograph? What does that photograph tell us of a life, as you said, what life was like? Great. Well, again, I feel like we could spend lots of time with this, and I hope there are people thinking of wonderful topics. Speaking of World War II, we at the archives have material that relate to, for example, the Monuments Men, if you ever saw that film. So we have papers relating to those people who are attached to the US Army to try and save European works of art. So that would be another example of World War II materials that we have. Right. Shall we go on, Philippa? So I was thinking about skills students might acquire through working with the primary source, and I think this notion of empathy. I think a lot of you have lifted that up. What was it like to be a child? What was it like to be the adult? What was it be like to try and organize an art class under these conditions, where you could only take a few things with you, you're only given a small allotment of things. So I think that notion of empathy, and I think that also life on the home front in different places would also build that sense of empathy. I think going back to what we talked about earlier, that notion of being exposed to different points of view, we could compare this photograph with another primary source about the same phenomenon. There are definitely other photographs taken of the incarceration camps, of the internment camps? How does this one compare to others? Ansel Adams, for example, took a number of photographs of these camps. So doing that, how did the different photographs give you a different story? I think curiosity, evaluation, what more do you need to know to understand what's going on in the scene? And I'm going to scroll up because I think we had a wonderful series of, what, who, and why questions that someone had put into the chat. So I want to lift up those. Yeah. Blythe, who are they? Where are they? Why are they working outside? So just using this as a place to spark that curiosity and critical evaluation. What more do I need to know to answer those questions? And then critical thinking. Where could I find that additional information? What would be a reliable source? So for example, if I was in LA, I would say, let's take a look at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. They actually have physical artifacts on site there from the internment camp experience. You can look at some of those online. So helping them find, where would I find good information? If they went to newspaper accounts of that period, how reliable are all those newspaper accounts? What point of view do they tend to represent? So I think, getting them to think about, as many of you lifted up already, that each primary source will represent different points of view, different kinds of narratives. So again, this is probably for many of you kind of natural, intuitive, the way you would work anyway, but just wanted to kind of set this out for you. Um, some steps to take, particularly if you're new to primary source literacy. Pick that primary source that or sources that align with your learning objectives and that are accessible to students. And I'm going to come back to this point that the journey of discovery can be part of their learning journey. Many of the teachers we work with often design kind of scavenger hunts to have the students go on like a museum website or our website to find certain materials. And that searching can be part of the discovery too. What words do I need to use to find something in a big database, for example? And then, starting with that close looking, design questions to promote close looking. I always started with, where does your eye go first? Where do you find your attention going? And just sometimes, particularly for students who are quiet, not always the ones who are vocal, just saying, walk me through what you're seeing. That was a great entry point for them. And then often asking, what do you see that you might not have expected? What's unusual for you? And the fact, I think some of you are picking up, oh, some are using pencils, some are using paintbrushes. They're not all using the same medium. People gazes in different directions. And then whose perspective, whose point of view is being represented here? And then questions that can help promote that inquiry, further inquiry. If they're not coming to it naturally, just prompting them, why do you think the photograph was taken? How and why do you think the photograph was saved? Again, he saved this coming back from the camp, back to California. Why did he save it? Why was that so important to him? There was also a camp newsletter that was created and that described the art school. So, he saved those as well. And then help them to think about context, which I think a lot of you really were eager to do that. What happened during this time period? Why might an image be taken at this time? Who might have been the intended audience, the intended purpose? Great. So with that, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the program we've been running here at the archives, Teaching with Primary Sources. And if everybody, Blythe has an album that she's willing to share. So I know Philippa will be eager to collect some of those resources. Absolutely. So our Teaching with Primary Sources program is one that we've been working with teachers. We've done it a couple of years now. We began it, of course, pre-COVID, and we were doing it in person. And then COVID taught us we could actually do this program online. Some of the participants have contributed to the Learning Lab, so you'll find some modules in the Learning Lab from this. There's a couple key things I just want to share with you from this program. So Philippa, if you could go to the next slide. So a lot of the teachers who participated in this program have created resources. So if you want to see those, they've been all collected together on a website page that Philippa's also captured in that learning collection. So I just wanted to say, if you want to kind of one-stop shopping for examples of resources that have been created using our resources, I really encourage you to come here, because I saw a few people in the chat saying, oh, do you have other ideas of primary sources that we could use? So I encourage you to kind of lift up and reuse, because these teachers shared them with us to be able to, for others to use them. So Philip, if you want to go to the next slide. So those sources include Learning Lab collections and also articles. So if you're interested in kind of learning about how other teachers have approached it, one teacher, for example, had the students use primary sources to create a timeline. So you might get some teaching exercises or assignments that that you might get ideas from. And Annie's timeline is one you could have a student do individually, but it's also really well suited to doing as group work. We'll go on to the next. But this is where I really want to stop and spend some time talking with you, is the lessons learned. These are things teachers in our program have shared with us, and I suspect there are things you've experienced too. So at the very least, you'll know by the end you're not alone. But we've also have some tips that can be used to address some of these lessons learned. So Philip, if you want to start walking us through these. So you may know this already, but we've heard this again and again from teachers. The students really need help in learning to evaluate critically materials they find on the internet. Like, how do I know this is true? How do I trust this? So you really do need to walk them through and say, where did you find it? Don't forget to write that down or take a screenshot. Where did you find it? Help them think about, is it a reliable repository? Here at the archives, we have professional staff that critically evaluate everything we bring in and label it, so that if we know who the photographer is, we can say that, or if we don't know, we can say that as well. So you'll probably need to help them learn how to evaluate. That may not come naturally to them. And I suspect I'm telling you things you already know. But Philip, if you want to go to the next one. This is one that I find really interesting. Students think of the internet as flat. Now, what do we mean by the internet is flat? In other words, if I do a Google search and don't find anything from the Google search, then it doesn't exist. But as many of you know, and it's very true of our website, you have to go onto our website and search within our website to find materials. So you really have to teach them how to search. It's like working with them in a library. How do you find things in a library? How do you find things in a museum? So you really have to work against that idea that everything can be answered just with putting everything in a Google search box. Yeah, and this is what I mean. They need help searching beyond Google. As I said, a lot of our teachers have designed little scavenger hunts. Well, they will tell students to go to our website and then give them something they have to find inside our website to get them to learn how to go inside our website. If we go to the next one. And students need help understanding the value of repositories. And I mean like things that collect, like us, and that there are professional processes associated with museums, libraries, and archives. This might even be a really nice way to teach them about jobs and professions associated with museum, libraries, and archives. They may know of librarians, but maybe they don't know what an archivist is. So I think helping them learn a little bit about what happens behind the scenes can also be a way to help them think about careers that they might not have heard of before. We'll go to the next one. And as I said, they're very engaged by the process of detective work, scavenger hunts, finding things, getting to answer those questions. I really encourage you to leverage that natural curiosity. And our teachers in our program have just found that just to be such a great way to get them started. But they may need help thinking about how search works. They may not naturally understand what's a keyword. How do I think about keywords, or what's a subject word? So you may need to help them think about that. That sometimes when you type something very precise and the computer can't match it, you're not going to find what you need, and you need to use a more general descriptive category. And here's something we've been hearing a lot from our teachers. They said they always assume the students are more digitally savvy than they are because they were born digital, but that's not what they're finding. That they actually, as I said, struggle sometimes to do things like search. And again, they want everything to be just easily surfaced up. So they may need help navigating the internet, even though they've been born using it, so to speak. Philip, if you want to go. And students often lack time and resources. So what we've been hearing from our teachers is they often just try to do their homework. You probably have heard this on their phones, 10 minutes between things. And so, maybe using your class time to get them to slow down, do some of these activities, and, kind of working through those processes. I think it's great. I see some teaching with primary sources courses that people have taken. Yep. And, this may not be a surprise to many of you, but many students cannot read handwriting. And, I'm of the age where I had to do, Putman's penmanship exercises. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you just be thankful for that. But students can't read handwriting. So, but there is a solution for that. Don't despair. And Philippa's going to go to the next slide. The Smithsonian has a transcription center. And Carolyn, you're right. The Smithsonian, this is all volunteer. And this could be a great way to engage your students. And we have volunteers who transcribe handwritten letters into one of those typewritten texts. So this is an example of one of our projects. We had American artists in Paris who were writing home. And people really like the idea of, visiting Paris vicariously through these letters and then transcribing them. So I just going to close by that notion of that treasure hunt, that notion of trying to find items. Here's an example. This is the same. Oh, sorry, this got cut off. This should be to the Obata family. But, one thing I like to talk about a lot is I think a lot of students sometimes have this idea that artists always work by themselves, in the studio by themselves. But in fact, a lot of artists say that they get a lot of their ideas and support from friends and family. So one exercise scavenger hunt is to invite the students find other materials in our archives that show who was friends with the artist. So this is a letter from Ansel Adams to the teacher of that art camp on Chiro Obata, sending holiday greetings. So this is a great way to show that the Adams family was friends with the Obata family and that they offered each other mutual support. So the idea that artists knew each other, were friends, and could be part of the same network could be a nice little scavenger or detective journey for them. And then, Philippa, hopefully this will work. If we click, maybe it didn't translate. Of course, it worked in our trial run. Yeah, I think maybe that video is not working, but hopefully it'll work when we share it out. Oh, try it now. See if it works. Yes. So I'm showing you here how to find materials on our website. So these are the papers for the artist that I was showing you. You can land on a web page, and then there's something called a finding aid that lists all the materials we have. So it's like a PDF, but if you want to find different kinds of materials, you read through the finding aid. The finding aid is also nice because we include a biography of the artist. So if you want a quick background on the artist, these are very well researched, very well done by our archivist here. So I would really recommend, and gives you information about that art school that he started that eventually had 600 students in it. This also shows you the keywords we've associated with it. So again, this is by going to our website, looking up this artist, and then you get the finding aid. And then the things that are associated with it, if you wanted to do a search, those are keywords you could use to search. Then on the left, where you see that icon that looks like a kind of mountain with a blue background, those show you that there's digitized materials. So you can click on any one of those and it will take you to the digitized material. And then you click again and you could get any of those materials as a digital file that you can download. So here's an example. You had to have a visitor slip to have someone come visit you at the camp. And so this is a visitor slip to come see the Obata family. So anything that has that mountain icon next to it has been digitized. You can download it and then you can use it right away in your classroom. This is that letter that I was just showing you of the Adams family writing to the Obata family. And again, you can download it, take it away and use it in your classroom. And this is what I mean about the journey of discovery. The internet is not flat. You have to really dig in. So I think that should be, yep, that closes us out. And then just showing another letter. And then this is a article that one of our participants wrote about using this collection as part of teaching with primary sources. So I've talked for quite a bit. So do we have a department devoted to music and musicians? Not here at the archives. We're about the visual arts, but certainly our Center for Folk Life has wonderful things associated with folk life music. So I would definitely check out their materials for music and musicians. And they have a great digital resource where you can listen to short snippets of different music from across the nation called Masters of Tradition. So that's one of my favorite resources from there. Great. Center for Folk Life at the Smithsonian.
I'll find a link for that. We actually did a cultivating learning session about the Masters of Tradition.
Yeah.
And then I'll add another link. We also did a cultivating learning with the Japanese American National Museum.
Yes, they're
So
terrific.
while you're answering questions, I'll put those links in.
Great. So I'm going to switch over and look in Q&A. Is there a database of all the various archives and archival collections in the US? And you've gotten some great suggestions, Digital Public Library of America. I'm going to also drop in another place that it's not complete, but it's not bad. And it's called the Social Networks and Archival Context. So I'm dropping that link into the Q&A for that. Great. But I love how others are answering questions too. So the databases, so teachers, teaching the primary sources, Teachers Network, and that collective I mentioned, the Digital Public Library of America, and we've got some other digital libraries, and I've mentioned in the Q&A something called the Snack Cooperative. Great. Other questions? I love how this community is supporting each other and giving great answers and tips for each other. So I really do hope, Philip, I know you're busy, busy, busy capturing. So
Yeah, what I'll do is after the session, I'll go back and go through all the comments and add in some of those ideas to the collection too.
it's fabulous. Very generous community. Any other questions I can answer for folks? I know our time has just flown by. Yeah, what kinds of tips would you give a teacher bringing kids to an archive? It's a really interesting thing. I think, on the face of it, people will say, oh, bringing kids to an archive, right? Manners, no drinks. So we do the only thing no food, no drink, and washing hands. We don't make people wear gloves. That's kind of an old way because actually the gloves can deteriorate, but we don't want sticky finger candy left on the letters. So I think just explaining, but I always find it really helpful to explain to young people why you would want to do that. That we collect and save these materials so we can preserve them for future generations. And then I think just picking some really visually enticing materials for them to look at and ask questions about. And I particularly like that Obata image because it has children in it. I think that notion of building empathy so that the archives don't feel like they're dusty old things that pertain to people that are so far away from me. So yeah, I think just preparing them, and that's what I mean about giving them a little acclimation that some places you have to put your backpacks and things in another room. Oh, and pencils. A lot of places would prefer that you just use pencils because then if you accidentally mark something, it can be erased. Whereas if you use a marker, um, but yeah, I think exactly, not just saying these are the rules, but why do we save things? And when we save them, how do we want them to look for the people in the future? So then how do we want to treat these? And I think then it's easier to remember the rules too, because then they make sense to you. Great. And I will say, we have artists who did children's books in our collection. So sometimes you could even just start with something that feels very naturally to them, but point out that it was actually made a long time ago. I mean, Winnie the Pooh is, sort of evergreen as a story, right? But it's an artifact now too. Um,
Any other
great.
questions, comments? So I would just like to thank you, Anne, for being with us today and for our wonderful participants. I'll be sure to add your comments and ideas and recommendations to the Learning Lab collection. And if anyone would like to join us next month with Orlando Serrano, I just put the link into the chat so you can um, register for that.
Right. And
And
as I mentioned, we have oral history. So as you listen to his session on listening, you might bring some of that back to our oral histories. So, and I just want to thank this generous community for all your suggestions. It's so supportive, really wonderful.
so thank you, everyone, and thank you, Anne, and
Thank
take
you.
care,
Thank you,
everyone.
Hulba.